If I asked you to get a piece of paper and something to write with, and to make a numerical list of all the things that you would be willing to die for, how long is your list?
Panther 48.
Willing to die for.
Panther 48.
Willing to die for. How long is your list?
What is the tribal self?
Panther
The
48.
tribal self is what goes above the immediate acquaintances of the social.
Willing to die
The
for.
family, the people you know, live next door.
You would be willing
I'm
to
talking
die
about
for.
tribal self.
Panther 48.
I'm talking about those movies, those yet unborn, and those who are the
How
ancestors.
long is your list?
So the connection with the ancestors is tied into the tribal self.
Panther 48.
What does that mean? That means that the tribal self constantly reminds us
Willing to die for.
that we don't have the
How
right
long is your
to
list?
claim independence.
Panther 48.
All right. Well, before I share the screen, I just like to always start off with somewhat of an introduction. The goal with majority of our public PE classes is really to provide conscious input to the community in regards, as well as obviously membership, in regards to approaches, and come from a perspective that's often not covered in regards to whatever political position or point or information we're trying to provide. So with that being said, tonight we're going to dive into something that's obviously very dear and required by all of us that are organizers or that seek to be organizers in the community. And that's dealing with solutions. Although on the surface that may sound like the obvious, as we dive into tonight's lesson, we'll find that there's a lot of things that most people may not take in consideration when dealing with actual solutions. So let me go ahead and share the screen here just a second. Got a couple more people jumping in. All right, let me share the screen. And those of you that are in the Panther Party are very familiar with the concept of our 3Ds, which is us talking about define, develop, and defend. Well, with that being said, we always have to start off with setting a framework to reach a distinction between providing answers and developing a solution. But we must always be able to confirm our definition of foundation. Now, what I mean by definition of foundation really goes into what I stated a second ago about define, develop, and defend. We have to have some point of reference that we're all working from in order to have a symbolization of where we're going to be headed as we move forward in what freedom and what self-determination looks like to us. And that obviously changes as we develop ourselves, but we have to at least start off with a workable definition. So without a proper baseline to reference, so just a second, got some people in the waiting room again. Okay. So without a proper baseline for reference, synchronization or synchronous thought is compromised, leading to the route back to unaddressed failures and recrossing bridges we have already know will lead to a disaster. And that's important because the more people that are involved in your specific organization, your specific movement, your specific task, or an operation, is the more opportunities for things to go south or things to not necessarily be on the same page in terms of just the end game or what it is our objectives are and how we go about dealing with those objectives. So as you're dealing with what we call a definition of foundation, these are the kind of things that get addressed. And we also talk about that as we cover what we refer to within the Panther Party as briefings. Within those briefings, everybody should have specific tasks or duties that they are assigned. And if for whatever reason you're unaware or don't know what that means, then you definitely need to reach out to your chain of command as such. So that forms a definition of foundation. Within that definition of foundation, now we get to move forward toward what is the objective that we're set out to deal with. But by going into that, now, especially as it applies to establishing something that's going to benefit the people, benefit the movement, then we have to approach this knowing the distinction between answers as opposed to just solutions as opposed to just answers. So I want to start off by talking about the position in which they like to keep, should I say, opposition or oppression or imperialism like to keep us in. And so this quote comes from the 48 Laws of Power, which is law number 11. Learn to keep people dependent on you. To maintain your independence, you must always be needed and wanted. And I find it's real important, and we can't read too fast to where we're reading over what is being stated here. It basically says here, to maintain your independence, you must always be needed and wanted. It's very important that you keep that in the forefront as to when you talk about how power and control is utilized against the masses. The more you are relied on, the more freedom you have. And notice that it's basically saying by being relied upon and by taking someone else's freedom, the more freedom you have. Make people dependent on you for their happiness and prosperity, and you will have nothing to fear. Never teach them enough so that they can do without you, which is basically global domestication. And again, this goes into why we find ourselves having to draw a clear distinction between addressing problems and working with solutions, is because society, as it applies in terms of civilization, in terms of social engineering, is based on keeping the people ignorant, keeping the people, like it says here, dependent upon you for your independence. And that's speaking from the position of a power structure. Now, in saying that, we want to go into another area, which is what we call the triad of control: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. The first step is thesis, which is to create a problem. The second one was the antithesis, is to generate an opposition to the problem, which creates the fear, the panic, the hysteria, and cause the people to be in a point to where they want something to be done. And then the third step is a synthesis, is to offer the solution to the problem created in step one. That change, which would have been impossible to impose on the people without the proper psychological condition achieved in steps 1 and 2. So from that standpoint, what you're talking about is a system that is designed to create a problem, so that in creating a problem, the same people that created that problem can bring you the solution. So it is by design at that point, there's a second here. It is by design at that point that the people that are in control create a situation to where they maintain that level of control by introducing the problem in the first place. And from that standpoint, that goes right back to what we talked about with law number 11 within the 48 Laws of Power, which is to keep the people dependent upon you, is to keep them in that perpetual cycle of the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis by creating conditions that bring about problems that you've already got the solution to, because you're the one that projected and created the problem in the first place. And so that creates that global dependency and a global domestication of the masses of people. And by doing things in that pattern, in that fashion, you start actually diluting a person's ability to critical think. And by doing that, it also will get into why we have to draw a distinction between answers and solutions. Anybody got question or comment they want to make in regards to that before we move on to the next slide? All right.
Yeah, this this right here remind me of the powers that may be, or the people in control, and playing the strings behind the scenes of what's going on. And so it's important to make that line in the sand, or that to distinguish myself from you. You know what I mean? As far as the approach to the powers that may be, that's actually pulling the strings, and embracing the moral responsibility to not be susceptible to being involved, or being you gotta bulletproof yourself.
Yeah.
And that's what people, in the revolutionary lines of train of thought, when they get to talking about not participating in capitalism and stuff like that, it's a conscious decision, at the end of the day, to not be able to, be under this kind of control.
Right.
And in the culture, it's like, it's too many people looking up to these neocons that are propped up, by whatever power structure it may be. So I feel like this is important just because of the time and the climate we're in, where people are as politically educated as they are, currently.
Gotcha. Yeah, and the thing about kind of what you're getting at as well is, as a person is in the community working toward making change, if we actually want to be, and it kind of goes into the background, I know it may be faint and hard to see, but this is actually a pen and that Cleveland had, with a statement that he said, if you are not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. But by basically just drawing a polarization stating that you have to pick a side. And so that's an old Panther pen that Cleveland used. So from that standpoint, kind of like what you're getting at is, we have to be able to recognize, really, and this goes into something discussion I had earlier today, recognize who the enemy is. And since we're taught a certain way, literally from birth, on how to be domesticated, based upon, especially nowadays, which television and radio and media being so ingrained in part of the day-to-day life cycle, that a person would basically not be aware of the fact that they are being programmed to operate at a lower certain level. And so stepping into the point of being a part of the solution is super critical, that we are able to recognize how we are being attacked. And this goes into that. And the more you practice knowing how to deal with scientific method, the more powerful you'll be able, and the better you'll be able to deal with in terms of being visionary and moving the people to a higher level. But so we're saying that the next thing we want to do is get into, within our mechanism structure, we have two areas that we go into called the denial and the coping. So we want to talk about these, and it's referred to as the bipolar injunctions of a victim, aka survival mode, because that's what we find ourselves in. Just a second, make sure everyone's muted. So that's what we find ourselves in. So in dealing with denial, before we learn to internalize who we are, address problems, and not just cope with the symptoms, we must first be willing to admit, self-reflect on our own failures, and call out dysfunctional patterns. And again, the key to that is that we first have to be willing to admit and then deal with self-reflection. This is not done to pass blame, but in fact to allow us to move beyond blame as the excuse to not perform the necessary internal work needed to form the proper process of personal and collective repair. But first, it requires personal accountability And often victimization causes one to look outward for blame. This denial of reflective inner awareness can be the result of post-traumatic slave disorder or unprocessed psychological pain. Denial can also apply to a society that operates from the luxury of entitlement and not realizing the freedoms it has gained may be the result of stripping others from their freedoms. And that's important because now when we talk about this law number 48, 48 laws of power, law number 11, learn to keep people dependent on you. To maintain your independence, you must always be needed and wanted. There's two things I need to point out about that may not be aware, may not be obvious to us. If you just read that straight across in text without seeing the conditions that we all fall under, you would think that that is something that is consciously done in terms of keeping people dependent upon you. But now we have to look at the structure in society, especially as it applies to like the United States of America. As a collective, here within the United States, as citizens of the United States operates, especially when you talk about the branches like the CIA, operate in positions to where the main thing that is done is crippling other countries and keeping them dependent upon the United States through what's referred to as foreign aid. We see the same thing when we talk about the globalization and what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. By Russia blocking or quote unquote letting Ukraine block some of the foreign aid that it has, you have a continent of Africa to where millions and millions of people are what? Dying from starvation because they depend upon the wheat and the food supply coming from Russia. And see, a lot of people would look back and be like, well, how dare Ukraine blocks that, or how dare they stop that, or how dare Russia tries to use this as an advantage. But if you look at what we're talking about here, learn to keep people dependent upon you. To maintain your independence, you must always be needed and wanted. The more you relied on, the more freedom you have. So in essence, a lot of times when a lot of countries allow themselves to be put in a position to where aid becomes the necessary element for you to have a day-to-day just level of living within your country by depending upon these foreign aids, then what happens, it creates that condition to where you're coping. Because what they're not doing, what Russia, the United States, and any other country could do is create solutions that fight hunger, that fight starvation. But instead, what they do is they feed you. They give you the food instead of giving you the tools to where you can raise and grow your own. You see, the whole point is on the outside appearance, it'd seem as though you're doing a good thing because you're feeding the people. But what you're not doing is you're not creating a situation to where they can feed themselves. So from that standpoint, you create that global domestication and that global dependency, which in turn creates higher levels of independence for you because now you're relied upon. And so we have to be able to take a step back and see how we all end up playing, even no matter how minute of a role, we all end up playing a part in that fashion. And this even goes into some of the discussions I have with a lot of the OGs in regards to just running Panther programs. When we run programs that are addressing, basic needs, the idea is to get people to a position to where they are capable of operating without your constant handouts. Because if you are in this mode to where all you care to do is supply a handout, then you are enabling a population of people to constantly be dependent upon you for their very means of survival, which is why this is referred to as survival mode in the bipolar injunctions of a victim. And so in saying that, to the Panther, infrastructure is the apex of solution, and denial is the bedrock of enslavement. So we have to be at a point within ourselves where we can self-reflect and realize and call things out as dysfunctional patterns. By being able to do that and call it what it is, a dysfunctional pattern, now we can approach that and attack that as a problem. But until I am willing to address that there is a problem with a specific thing, then I'm in that denial stage. And as long as I'm in that denial stage, I can't fight against something that I do not agree that is even a problem that needs to be addressed. And so that's important, because subconsciously we may tend to operate day to day without realizing that some of the things that we do are creating codependencies, which are not solutions. It may be an answer, but it's not a solution. And so we need to draw that distinction like we started off talking about, because it's very important that as we talk here and as we develop and go into this class, that you are able to put yourself in personal examples that you've dealt with in the past, to where you have been satisfied with an answer as opposed to dealing with a solution. Brother Chief, go ahead and speak.
Yeah, that reminds me of Brother Fred Hampton when he talked about heightening the contradictions. It's important to put this kind of stuff on blast, because it's very covert in the way these things happen. To your average person that's just dealing, not from a level of education that maybe someone else is, or political education, I would say. They may be in the books, but it's our job to heighten these contradictions, right? To just lay it out how it is, how we see it, so people can digest this kind of stuff. Because if we don't, then that's what they're banking on. I think Omali Yeshitela in his book articulated very well the parasitic relationship between us and the United States, where it's like, they latch on to us. They don't want us to break away. You know what I mean? They just want to give you enough feel good to think that, they want to sell you hope.
Right.
And so you have to recognize it as, what it is, which is a parasite or a parasitic relationship.
Yep. That's exactly right. And even in saying that, to give you an example of what Quran is saying, one of the slogans from the presidential trail that we supported in the past was "Keep hope alive." We want a new hope. The whole point is when you address things from that stance of talking about hope, you are again putting your faith in the hand of someone else. And the idea here is kind of like he's saying, it's these subtle things that we tend to do that fall into the patterns of dysfunctionality that we may not necessarily recognize. And when you have individuals that are operating with this lack of awareness, when we collectively come together, then what you will find is more of us collectively start being able to not operate at the level that we should, because we have a collective level of inability to see the solution, to see the difference between solutions and answers. So the next point here, from denial, we get coping. Hold on a second. From denial, the next one would be coping, which coping utilizes the tools of the glue factors, which is guessing, luck, understanding, emotion, and survival. So that acronym basically spells glues. And that's a good one, I would say, for y'all to definitely put in your repertoire, in terms of just being able to talk to the average person about what coping means. Because when you see it as the acronym of glue, then it makes all the sense in the world from a psychological standpoint, which glues is the conditional workarounds. And I emphasize workarounds because that's what it is, over self-repair until empowerment functionality is internally ready to be addressed. And so that's important because, again, a person has to be ready to deal with the self-repair and ready to step up to the plate and address empowerment functionality. Until then, they're dealing with just coping. So coping tends to be a natural process of tactical in-time moment processing, which is too often exchanged for a solution-based approach. And what we mean by in-time moment processing is basically, it's like, and y'all may have heard me, some of y'all may have heard me say this multiple times. It's like running an obstacle course. At first, you're slow. At first, you stumble. At first, you may not be able to complete it. But over time, if you condition yourself through in-time processing, moment processing, and you stick at it, you become good with glues. You become good at dealing with jumping over the hurdles, going under the hurdles, going around the hurdles. And before you know it, you have a lifestyle of being able to achieve and deal with the obstacle courses. The problem here is simply being able to cope with something, simply being able to go over, around, under, and through something is not the same as removing these obstacles from your life. So too often we get so good at being able to maneuver around, through, over, and under the obstacles that we tend to think that that is a solution, simply because they don't seem to slow me down or stop me, because I'm good at dealing with obstacle courses. But again, when we talk about this from the standpoint of fighting oppression, we talk about from the standpoint of recognizing not everybody is built and wired the same. Then you realize that dealing with an obstacle, leaving an obstacle in the road for the next person to have to solve and over hurdle like you did is not a solution. That is just coping with the conditions of oppression. And too often that's what we find ourselves doing. And so it is dealing with those two points of what we refer to as bipolar injunctions of a victim. This is where society seems to find itself teetering between either denial or coping. And we say stuck in these survival modes. And when you talk about being able to deal with something as it applies to solution-based approaches, then you must be able to recognize the denial and the coping and realize that neither one of these can operate at the same capacity as if you are actually dealing with and addressing something from a solution-based approach. So from that, the next thing is to cover scientific thought. And so this dives into what it takes to change our mode of thinking and to move us away from understanding and to deal with understanding and overstanding. And let me elaborate a little bit on that, because when we talk about the glues here, we say guessing. Guessing is when you literally really don't have no idea where to start, right? And so you don't know where to start because you haven't formed a perspective on past, present, future, which is another aspect of the trifecta. So you guess. Luck is what you call something when you have no idea how it worked, no idea how you seem to have made it through that scenario. So I guess I was just lucky, because you're not dealing with a scientific thought on an analysis of the conditions. You just managed to deal with something through an element of obstacle manipulation. And then understanding is because too often we put ourselves at the driver's seat in terms of maneuvering ourselves through life, as opposed to being able to be in control and architect our life. So that's an understanding. And an example I always like to use is a vehicle when it applies to that. For instance, understanding is being able to drive a motor vehicle. Understanding is being able to apply maintenance to that vehicle if it breaks down, so that you can get back on the road. And overstanding would be having the ability to create your own mode of transportation, so that you not only can drive, but you can design, create, build, and produce the automobile, or produce the method of transportation yourself. That is overstanding. So when we are okay with living in a world of just simply understanding something, then we put ourselves in a position to where, again, we are at the mercy of the architects. We are at the mercy of the grand designers. We are at the mercy of the person that has made that chessboard that we're playing on. And so we have to be able to move away from just simply only understanding something. And then emotion from that standpoint is if your drive to develop a solution is based on emotion, then it is not going to give you the willpower, nor is it going to give you the sustainability to continue to move forward and make that a lifestyle. So we can't allow emotions to be why we want change to take place. And then the last one again is survival, because the deal here is knowing the difference between surviving and living. Okay, so like what we said in dealing with law number 11, if you want to maintain, like I say, if you want to maintain your independence, you keep people dependent upon you. That is, again, that element of enslavement. That is, again, creating a situation to where you are not capable of operating and functioning without, going through the process of being domesticated. So we want to deal with self-determination, and in dealing with self-determination, you have to know that we have to move beyond survival. So in saying that, the next element here and the next part is to go into scientific thought. A hierarchy of scientific thought must be established between the trifactor of physics, ethics, and politics. Now that's important when you talk about those three: physics, ethics, and politics. This takes us to the concept of social physics. And that's another thing, because a lot of times y'all may hear me talk about social engineering, but we also have to talk about the science of social physics and what that means. To reach the root of a problem, you must dig in the dirt. And I say that because basically we have to recognize that when you talk about the root of something, that's being something when something is embedded within a foundation. Being embedded within a foundation means you have to break that foundation, which is in essence talking about getting in the dirt. And you can't dig dirt. You can't go to the foundation of something or the root of something without getting dirty, without having some stress that you deal with. So we have to be willing to fuss with ourselves in order to do so. And in from that point of view, it bonds the relationship between what's referred to as social statics, which is existing social structures, and social dynamics, which is the social change. Although both involve a bridge in laws of social life, the process of speculation precedes the process of operation. Thus, the speculative nature of perception shapes our philosophy, culture, practices, and forms the mind and mentality as the basis of all assumptions, hypotheses, and beliefs about reality and living. And that, again, comes by way of recognizing, when we talk about scientific thought, the difference between what a social statics is and social dynamics. Because to kind of break that down, when something is considered static, it is locked in a certain state. Whereas dynamics means that it has kinetic energy and is moving and is constantly changing. Too often, like for instance, social statics can fall under how we practice a specific religion. Practicing a specific religion that causes you to not be able to add or take away from it removes you from the ability of dealing with social dynamics, which is the change and the constant change, which goes into when we talk about revolution as it applies to living life. And so when we find ourselves stuck in social statics, we are not able to deal with a dynamic, workable, movable, plausible operation. So that's why we stated here that the process of speculation precedes the process of an operation. Because going back to when the Panther Party, when we talk about define, develop, defend, before you define something, you first have to perceive it, right? And then as you perceive something and you develop a solution, develop a definition, then the next thing is to deal with the development of it. And the development takes persistence, or takes you to pursue that which you're attempting to develop. And then when you go into the defense of something, then you must be willing to do what we refer to as preserve. So from that standpoint, the social dynamics and the social statics have to be clearly distinguished in order to move forward. So we say here, to draw a separation on having an answer revolves around the reference point of before and after the perceived condition of the problem. That's important, because again, you have to be able to know the time and place from which you are approaching something based upon the time and place that that problem is in operation, which goes into the social dynamics. How does that problem live? How does that problem evolve? How does that problem change? How does that problem not have to change? And so from that standpoint, you have to draw a distinction between the before and the after the condition is perceived. So every time something is brought to your attention as a problem, now you have to work your way back and see when that became a problem. And based upon when that became a problem, you can see how that became a problem, and you can start drawing a pattern to be able to deal with a plan of attack. And so one book I thought was very powerful, that's able to give you a holistic approach to looking at life from a position of addressing this, is what I'm put here in the footnotes: The Science of Science and the Science in Sciences by African Creation Energy. And a link is there for you to go check that out. Any questions or comments before we move on? All right, I keep going. All right, so we want to get into a specific example here. So for example, the problem of police brutality tends to be challenged from the position of going after the officers or bring attention to the department, but this approach is tied directly to the point of after. And that's important that we see that, which is the point of after the condition and a personality of emulation. While this does provide an answer, because keep in mind, it is providing an answer, it does not provide a solution, because the focal point leads to a person taking blame and bearing the responsibility. But a solution requires more than responsibility, it requires accountability. The difference between faulting a responsible party and holding the position of accountability is one warrants punishment for an event that occurred, which is reaction. The other holds a change in the conditions that make the reoccurrence improbable by removing the conductive generator, which is action. And this is also a deeper dive into the concept of dealing with overcoming an obstacle or learning to work through an obstacle, as opposed to removing that obstacle. To give you a perfect case in point, from addressing the Constitution as it applies to the amendments that tie into having quote unquote the property that was now freed and given the opportunity to practice the same thing as other people that wrote the Constitution. Basically, that is drafting a way for them to operate as though you are equal, as though you have are able to exercise and have the same rights as a human being. But simply because legislation has to put you on par with something that was written prior to you being recognized as a free people, then in essence you are dealing with this from giving you an answer or giving you a way to cope with racism as opposed to eradicating racism. So the Constitution is written in such a way that we are coping with the effects of racism. But in order to actually address racism from that standpoint, you would need to simply remove the entire thing and rewrite it from the ground up as a position of the current kinetic operation and properties, which is why we talked about that, from knowing the difference between social statics and social dynamics. So dealing with the actual social change, you have to be able to put yourself in a position to where you are exercising and implementing power, as opposed to being fed aid, which is why we refer to a triad, which is the tri and the aid, as opposed to when we talk about trifactors. So there's a difference between a triad and a trifactor. And y'all may not have heard me, those of y'all hear me talk about the trifactors may not have heard me go into that aspect, but I'm now explaining and addressing that to you, that triads and trifactors operate on an opposite spectrum or opposite end. So when we talk about the people being in a position to where they are codependent upon their oppressor in order to operate at a certain level, that is giving you an answer, but it is not giving you a solution. And so we have to see how those are formed. And again, that goes into the one warrants of punishment for the event, which is again how you attack and come from the throat of that scapegoat, and you want that officer and you want possibly that department to be held responsible now for what has happened. But what you are not doing is creating a situation of accountability, which will prevent anybody from being able to then operate on just a level of responsibility. This is why when we talk about becoming a Panther and we talk about moving to a higher level, it is we use the word holding yourself accountable, and we don't use the word holding yourself responsible. We say you must be able to hold yourself accountable. So those two words are not interchangeable like too often you find people doing. And so even in stating that, going back to us talking about at the very beginning, when we talk about a definition of foundation, we have to set the example of the right and the proper word usage, because too often when we don't speak the correct words, we're granting power to other people over ourselves. And so it's important that we know when we are granting someone a power over us and when we are demanding our own accountability of self-determination in our own operation. Anybody got a comment about that? Because this is deep when we go into it from that point. And I want to make sure y'all got it. At least somebody give me a acknowledgement and make sure I'm not talking to myself. Okay, I see your heart.
Killing this, comrade.
All right.
Coming through loud and clear.
Thank you. Okay, so the next part of that is to take into account the standard definition for the two words, which is problem and solution. And this is just kind of going further into from an example perspective of what we talked about between the difference of action and reaction. So the resolve of a problem to respond to satisfactory to meet a successful by way of explanation, argument, or justification. That is the resolve of a problem. The resolute of a solution, the acting of solving, or the state of being solved. The disentanglement, now that's a difference. You don't deal with disentanglement when you're talking about the resolve of a problem. Only through the resolute of a solution can you deal with the disentanglement, because the disentanglement requires you to deal with the separation of past, present, and future, that trifactor. So the disentanglement of any intricate problem or difficult question, explanation, clearing up, used especially in mathematics, either of the process of solving an equation or problem or the result of the process. And now let me stop real quick there, because it's important that we recognize that it says here, used especially in mathematics, because now we got to get into the fact that when you talk about mathematics as being the universal language, you talk about mathematics as being the universal foundation, you talk about mathematics as being the source of dealing with solutions, you are stepping into a territory to where you cannot simply address solutions with answers. So now let's kind of break that down even further. Using the example of testing for knowledge of a subject, if one test is multiple choice, picking the best option, which is important because we talk about that in our skill level 1 training for those y'all as Panthers, and another test requires you to solve the equation, it is possible to get the right answer through deductive reasoning with multiple choice, but not be any closer to knowing how to solve a problem, aka picking from options, which is also referred to on another level, the lesser of the two evils. So I can apply deductive reasoning through basic logic and basic critical thinking and be able to kind of sort of, like I said, give myself an answer, kind of sort of give myself the ability to address this as it applies to responsibility. But check this out here further. But because social statics does not require innovation or consciousness of a source and obeys existing social structure, which is what we stated earlier, it is possible to use this route to sleep a population into mobilization around the effect and separate this effect from the true cause, which requires social dynamics in order to transform social change. And I know a lot of that sounds wordy, but I promise you, if you just keep reading into that and you think back on it, and you really are able to deal with the difference between social statics and social dynamics, and you are able to internalize problem solving as opposed to the resolute of a solution as opposed to the resolve of a problem, then you can start further dissecting and dealing with what we call disentanglement, so that you know the difference between an answer and a solution. Because again, let's just go back to basic academics. Now the way they are primarily teaching children how to pass is through the resolve of problems, through the deductive reasoning, in order for them to be able to be good at test taking and passing tests. Most of the tests are going to be multiple choice. So the bottom line is teaching you how to be able to approach something through multiple choice and pick an answer. And what we don't recognize is the psychological damage that does to the development of a person that separates you from being a visionary, from that person that's being able to just simply cope with life. And because we are now operating within the framework of Panther ideology, on a higher state of consciousness, we can see how that is not the best mode and the best way to reach a position of self-determination, to reach a position of all power to the people. Whereas if you don't have this knowledge, if you don't have this information that we're going over within your repertoire of weapons, you may find that oftentimes you were actually operating on the resolve of a problem as opposed to the resolute of a solution. And it is important. Now, I'm not stating that every single thing that we tackle, we want to come at it from the resolute of the solution. That is improbable at this point. But it is super important that you know the difference between the two. And by knowing the difference between the two, you are making an active choice on which direction to go. And so therefore, you can make the resolve of a problem be a tactic that leads you to the strategy of actually taking the people to the resolute of a solution. And so that's the whole point, is that we have to know when we are walking one path as opposed to walking the other path. And so again, internalizing the social construct of social statics and social dynamics is important for the revolutionary, because we have to be able to see really where we're headed. This is again the difference between being able to be a vanguard, a visionary, or someone operating in a position of teaching leadership. Chief Karan, you go ahead and go.
Yeah, this right here touched on a lot of things that I had already been thinking about. But you know, on a basic level, people are in a situation and they know this don't add up, right? When we're talking about the people, you know, this don't make sense. You know, in all these situations, we're talking about mathematics, right? Or adding, you know what I mean, or subtracting, right? So, or even if you talk about the 5% nation, right? You're talking about, you know, the 80% of people that are followers versus the 10 that are, you know, creators or leaders, and the 5 that, you know, are the outsiders or the people that had a foresight. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Yeah. So this makes a lot of sense. In the way of, you know, this even touches on the mobilization versus organization. We just hit it really touches on damn near everything. You know what I mean? Like that's the best way I can articulate in this mathematics. You know what I'm saying? So like, my like synapses are firing right now because it's just like it's just a way it's articulated in a way that just touches on so many different other things, right?
Got it. And see, that's the goal here. The goal is for y'all to be able to step back again and self-reflect and see how we put ourselves on one side of the fence or the other. And by doing so, it gives us a clear perspective in terms of knowing where we stand and knowing how to now address the trifecta of the individual approach, the family approach, and the collective or community approach. To know that we have to take ourselves through these proper stages, and knowing that you cannot, no matter how enthused you may be, that there's no shortcut to revolution. There's no shortcut to freeing ourselves from the position of being oppressed. Because again, just talking about what we started off with the law number 11, to keep the people dependent upon you, that is a process that takes time. That is a process that is wielded to a point to where it is now so much ingrained in society, so much ingrained in how we operate, is that it is perpetual. It is in perpetual motion. And being in perpetual motion, we have to learn to unlearn. And that's so hard, because this is also why, let's talk about this from a historical point of view, why the Black Panther Party was considered public enemy number 1 when they went to politicize the children through the food programs that they operate through the youth. Because it's one thing to deal with the elders in the older generation in terms of raising their consciousness, but when you start with a group of people that are not required to unlearn the wrong way that they've been taught to do something, and you're dealing with fresh minds that have never operated in that state of dysfunctionality in terms of the thought processing, you are creating and engineering a weapon for your liberation right off the bat, and they cannot allow that to continue. Go ahead, brother Chief.
Yeah, and that also reminds me of what y'all was talking about in the Panther 48 with the PE of being able to be bought, you know, like, you know, being able to put yourself in a position to where, you know, the colonizer is able to capitalize off of your distance with the community, which is the foundation, right? Yeah, and that also, you know, raised my ears, because we're bombarded with problems, right? Or perceived problems from, you know, a lot of these things are like you have to think about why, the who, what, why, where, when, like, why are these things in front of your face? Why are you seeing this on your TV, right? Why is this media showing you this and moving you in this manner, you know? And that's big on the social engineering part. And you have to be able to recognize that because you know, if we're talking about movement centric stuff, or we're talking about, you know, mobilizations, etc., I feel like the more they can kind of duplicate like real problems and real issues with like a manufactured one and put them in the same cereal bowl, you know, it gives you more to digest, and therefore you're not chipping away at the right problem.
Correct. That again, that goes into being able to break down and see that what we're talking about is a problem. So let me kind of go back real quick before I move forward and make sure I address that from one particular standpoint here. Let's see, where was I where I was thinking about this. Okay, right here, when we say the hierarchy of scientific thought must be established between the triactor of physics, ethics, and politics. So when we talk about physics, ethics, and politics, those elements within that trifactor have to be broken down. And so when we talk from the standpoint of physics, that actually gets into the problems, or how you approach a problem through the solution-based aspect of mathematics. Because when you're learning physics, for those of y'all that I've just even studied it from a very elementary level in high school or basic physics in college, the deal is you're learning about what's referred to as the natural principles of law, and how these natural laws are applied to just life in general. Especially for those people that have even taken this to the higher level of what I refer to of science in terms of martial science, because martial science gets into elements of physics in terms of how you maneuver the body in order to make it a weapon, as opposed to whether you're borrowing energy when you're dealing with your opponent, or you are dealing with the elements of force in order to be able to deal with joint manipulation, to be able to deal with limb destruction, to be able to deal with using someone's own weight against them. All those are elements of physics, and they are actual laws that, if applied correctly, will always give you the solution and the proper results. So that's physics. Now ethics gets into the rights and wrongs. Ethics gets into morality. So from that standpoint, when you're dealing with a problem that's based in morality, you have to know, well, from what side of the fence are you standing on in addressing this problem? What side of the fence are you standing on in identifying the best approach to dealing with the ethics? And then when we get into politics, this is where things get real sticky, because from a political standpoint, now we have to deal with the concept of denial and coping as it applies to where are the people being led. Are the people being led to a position of freedom, or is it simply being led to a position of being able to cope with or deal with what we call the lesser of the two evils? So when we go into scientific thought, we have to approach it with these three perspectives as it goes into whatever it is we're dealing with, as it applies to social statics and social dynamics. So it's real important. So there's a lot of stuff to unpack in what we're talking about today. But again, this applies across the board, all throughout the 10-point platform, all throughout the local objectives, all throughout just any grassroots movement and organizing, and as well as basic individual development for the person on the personal level. So that's one thing about our PE classes within the public sector, is we want to make sure we arm our people with information that they can turn around and use in their day-to-day life. And it's important that I stop and just address that real quick from the standpoint of within the Panther framework, we refer to everything that we teaching as political education. Why? Because from that standpoint, we recognize that especially our people have this negative connotation when they think about politics. But politics, as it applies to the overall thing, basically simply means governance. Whether we're talking about self-governance, family governance, or community governance. The bottom line is, if you want to deal with being a self-determined people, if you want to deal with a people being able to address things in a intact, functional perspective, you are dealing with the governance of your body, the governance of a body, the governance of a system. And so when you're dealing with systems, you have to be able to break down the interconnectability of how the different systems operate within their framework, which is why within the Panther Party, we have what we call a mechanism structure. That mechanism structure leads you into that ability to know what you're talking about. And just like what's being put in the chat, know thyself or know yourself. In order to know yourself, you have to know the enemy, but you have to be able to draw a distinction between where one starts and end, where the other one starts and end, and how they are phased in and out of operation with one another, which is why we talked about reaction versus action. So let me keep moving here where I left off at. Okay, so the next thing here on this last slide of this page, this is the weaponization of providing answers. This method of attack is currently plaguing society by sleeping the population with instant accessibility, causing personal acute logical awareness to be removed, sourcing which causes truth and facts to be marginalized under the wave of information overload. That is summing up a whole lot right there. Again, the weaponization of providing answers. When people pick up their phone and they ask Siri or ask whatever the names now are of the different social interactions with a computer, you're getting an answer. When you are so used to getting instantaneous answers, oftentimes it plays against your natural ability to deal with critical thinking and critical consciousness, specifically the transition to critical consciousness, because I want us to recognize that we have to move to higher levels always. So by providing you that answer and it being instantaneous, I'm not saying that we shouldn't use technology, but we have to understand that technology is moving at a rapid pace. The physical human vessel is not evolving at the same pace of the technology that we are in use of, which is why we break down the difference between understanding, understanding, and overstanding, and why I use a actual concept of a mechanical vehicle as an example. Because when we talk about the biological vehicle is not on the same pace as the mechanical vehicle. The carbon-based life form is not operating the same way as the silicone vessel or body. And so because of that, because one is such a rapid pace and the other one is dealing with the natural process of evolution, the only way, and this is the key thing here that touches on a whole different subject matter than what we're talking about now, to infuse the two in a marriage relationship is to create cybernetics. That's something that goes into a whole area of weaponization that we're not going to cover today, but I at least want to expose y'all to the fact that society is moving in order for the biological machine to keep up with the synthetic silicone machine. Cybernetics have to take place. All right. And so that is dangerous territory. And so we have to be aware of what we are up against. Okay. In saying that, this is again dealing with providing answers as a weaponization, which basically causes society to be able to sleep or you are sleeping the population, all right, which goes into the marginalization, which happens under information overload. All right. Anybody got something to state on that before I move on?
No, yeah, we've seen a lot of this. You know, over the years with the information overload, and that's kind of it's very effective because once you blow the tea kettle on a issue, you know, it's really one of the only answers to containment. Is like you have to be bombarded with this information so that you can kind of interject, you know, other information, and it's more like putting it on a level playing field, you know, and creating a polarity of like, okay, this is an issue, this is what y'all worried about, you know, let's get behind that, or the illusion of getting behind that, just so, you know, everything else could seep in. A good example of this is probably the NFL. When you saw the Black Lives Matters on the helmets, you know, and stuff like that. And then, you know, lo and behold, next season pops up, then you start seeing the FD. Well, if we could support that, we could support, you know, NYPD. And then when you see the FDNY, then you see, you know what I mean? Then it becomes just a ploy. And so, yeah, that stuff should be, you know, very apparent. But, you know, to the average person, it's like, oh, it's something that's here for all of us, but the oppression isn't here for all of us. So, you know, what are we really talking about?
Yeah, let me give y'all another point of awareness when we based on just what you talked about. That's referred to as through social engineering as leakage. Leakage is when you seep something into the population and you spoon feed them poison psychologically, from the standpoint of you get them used to seeing something, and to the point to where it's ingrained in their psyche without them being aware of what's actually happening. That is social engineering leakage. And y'all might not have heard me call speak on that, but that's what that is. That's referred to as leakage. And that actually goes right back into the triad concept of a thesis, an antithesis, which again deals with a synthesis. And that synthesis, people, is I want y'all to apply that as going back to what I said about cybernetics. The idea here is you have a basis, which is the creation of a problem. Now, mind you, it's just not coming upon a problem, but I am literally stepping back, seeing the population, and deciding how I want to attack them. As I decide how I want to attack them, I'm forming a thesis of operation. That thesis of operation now will be deployed based upon how I want to attack them, which is in essence the solution. The solution is the attack, which created a thesis point of view. And now the antithesis is how the emotional response or the glues go into operation, so that now when the people are demanding something be done, demanding an answer, not a solution, but an answer, they are trapped in that perpetual cycle now. Go ahead, Chief.
Yeah, and that goes back into that 5%, you know, yep. Or what we're talking about with being a forward observer.
Right.
Going into that, like, the conscious folks ain't the only one that's in the 5%. You know what I mean? It's like the people you're talking about that's doing this, they definitely not on a leader or follower polarity. Is they in the 5% for sure. So it's just being able to recognize that.
Yeah, it's being able to, one, recognize it. Number two, again, because at certain levels of consciousness, which is why we talked about it from the standpoint of critical thinking and critical consciousness, is one is to be able to be aware of it and start seeing how that poison is being fed. It's another thing to not be so ingrained in your reaction to something that you are able to be a visionary and lead the way into waking up the consciousness of the people and waking up the people to real solutions. Brother
Absolutely.
Addo, come on and speak on it.
Yeah, so when you say that this is a weaponization, it's the perfect word, and I actually want to revert back to a past topic that you discussed around psychological programming, and that's exactly what this is, because this is a weapon that is used against the people to make them more docile, to make them more malleable to the will of the system. So the word weaponization is absolutely perfectly used, and without recognizing that this is a weapon being utilized, we continue to fall into that programming.
That's right. That is right. And that's the scary part. That's why this type of information is so much needed as part of the ammunition that we equip ourselves with to try to work toward equipping the population with, which is why this specific class, and again, why I attempt to, especially as it applies to the dealing with people on a day-to-day basis, address things from a psychological approach, because the exposure of knowing that how most people think are not leading to them to come up out of being domesticated. And so I think it's very important that we recognize how we are being attacked, especially through psychological and psyops. Let me just use the word psyops from a military perspective, going back to what Chief Karan talked about being a forward observer. The psyops aspect, because this is how wars are fought and won on all levels. And so as a people, the sooner we recognize that we are at war, the more time and the more ability we have to be able to see the battlefield for what it is. And that goes into, and I do want to speak on this before I move on, the concept of that forward observer. The forward observer is another terminology to go into being a visionary. And in order for us to be a visionary, we have to be able to see that we're on a battlefield. And then we have to be able to deal with what we talk about as an acronym, TOYS, tools of your surroundings, in order to be able to recognize what is either going to be used for your demise or be able to be used for your enemy's demise. And so the greater we are at being able to address the battlefield environment as an individual, family, and a people, the more equipped we are at being able to do what I talk about all the time, and that's outpace the pace of oppression. Go ahead, Chief, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, one last thing. The TOYS acronym, it reminded me of a talk that Angela Davis had gave about the concept of armed struggle, and she went into the tools of your oppressor, right? So utilizing the falsehood that you think like I have enough guns or I have enough whatever, is like that's what they want you to think, essentially, right? Because they can crush that easy,
right? Yeah, that gets into the emotionalism. Let me move on next, and I'm not going to actually read through this part, but let me make this statement now. For those of y'all that don't already have a copy of this document, shoot me an email. Put the email in the chat. Let me say that. Put the email in the chat, and I'll make sure that you get a copy of this document, so that the things that I kind of just skip over, you'll be able to go back into and look at. But what I wanted to do here is go into just another case in point that we can use as an example in dealing with a case study of separating the difference between solution and answers. And this is affirmative action end date requirement exerted. So what's going on now in the Supreme Court, and that's why I said I'm just going to just talk a little bit about this, and then we can have a little dialogue, and then we move on. There's a case here that to where basically they're looking to take away affirmative action. Now, why this is important is because the conditions that are, again, going back to what I talked about when I addressed the state of the Constitution, the conditions that create oppression and certain types of oppression are able to be exercised, and the Constitution and certain laws are written to help deal with the effects of oppression from the stance of coping with oppression. Affirmative action happens to be one of those ones, because what you're doing is, since you don't have an actual solution on the table, what you're creating is a process in which people can cope with the fact that there is going to be racism, the fact that racism is embedded within the American culture. And so having affirmative action gives certain people an opportunity to still be able to have access to certain things and cope with oppression, and then fight with it in their own way. So the problem you have here, and from a legal standpoint and from a logical standpoint, the way to fight affirmative action and to create a situation to where it can be removed is by addressing the status in which America is going through certain stages to where the appearance of racism may not necessarily be something that we see this country removing itself from, but you do see a process in which things are getting better. And when you look at it on an individual level, it has that appearance, because the example can always be used that Black people have held the highest position of office within the country of the United States, referring back to Obama in terms of being a president. So as an individual, you're basically stating that any quote unquote person can lift themselves up by the bootstraps and become anything they want to be, going into the individual, using that individual, because when you're dealing with Supreme Court cases and you're dealing with cases, more than likely, again, you're dealing with things as it applies to the resolve of a problem, and instead of the resolute of a solution. And so therefore those cases, going back to the example we gave in regards to police brutality, talking about responsibility as opposed to accountability on the court level, if I basically state that, well, the way we address affirmative action is by giving it an end date, because America is getting better. And so with America getting better, there's going to become a point in time in when affirmative action is not necessary. So by writing that into law, by basically executing an execution date for something, then you are creating the situation to where you are causing the people to get on board with something that, again, appears to be a solution, but in essence is an answer. So as that apply, how do you even approach the fact that, well, in actuality, yes, there should be an end date to something. And so that is one of the ways in which they are able to defeat the approach to fighting for affirmative actions to stay on the books. And so that's what's super important here. And so I just wanted to bring that up as an example, because when you deal with one side basically saying do away with affirmative action from a polarity perspective, and the other side saying no, we need affirmative action, and somebody coming right down the middle and cutting between the two and say, well, just give it an end date. Now you find that where when you deal with the politics and you deal with the structure of Republican and Democrat, both representing the same head, one can be perceived at any given time the lesser of two evils. You eliminate the option of choice. You eliminate the ability to have choice, and you're stuck with options. And so when we talk about things from a revolutionary standpoint, when the people don't have choice and they are stuck with options, and we talk about this in our skill level number 1, then you have effectively removed their ability to be able to be self-determined as a people. And so this is in essence what is going on and what we find. And so I just wanted to use that as an example within our context of our talk just on a premise of dealing with current situations and current political climate, so that as we deal with moving forward in working with our people, we're able to draw into perspective how we are addressing, or how we can see the difference between providing answers as opposed to providing solutions, and how the justice system is intertwined in trapping us in a process of always having to revisit, again, like we said earlier, these same bridges over and over again, being like I stated earlier in the conversation today, on that hamster wheel. And when you're the one on the hamster wheel, you may not know that you're on the hamster wheel. In fact, most of the times you don't, because all you can see is the work and the action and the movement that you're doing. It takes a forward observer, like Chief said earlier, or it takes somebody on the outside being able to have a greater view or a holistic view to be able to tell you, yo, dude, you're not going nowhere. Because they can see the forest from the trees. And so we have to be able to take a step back from our action and be able to see whether or not we are dealing with action as opposed to reaction, which goes into taking apart the glues and unsticking things, which is that glue part, unsticking it so that we can dissect and get into scientific method. So I don't know if anybody has something they wanted to just comment on this, but I did just at least want to use that as an example, and you can read the, like I said, read the verbiage later. Anything anybody want to state on this?
Yes,
I
I
had
want to
dropped
say
some. Wait,
Oh, you want to go ahead, brother?
go ahead. No, I just dropped some links. From a CIA agent talking about the silent wars, and that's what I thought about when we had touched on this subject. Just something to look into.
Okay. Yes, yes, my name is Quillanell. I got invited out tonight by Anton. I thought this was good because I was actually just talking with another brother about, subjects that related to what you're explaining. And I wanted to just say, we have to be able to understand that this is in these people's nature to be able to do this and what they're doing. And in addition to that, we have to also understand that we're not going to be able to change their nature, because this is innately what is in them. And like you said, we are at war. There's been a declaration of war being posed against us. It just does not always seem as though it is posed against us because of how it is set up, because it's designed to be able to appear that way. So we just have to be able to keep that in mind and understand that.
Right. And we talk often about, again, when I talked about earlier, when I talked about dealing with physics, ethics, and politics, that Pacific trifactor, when we get into those, we deal with what we talk about the nature of evil, or the nature of a people. And I even like, and to me, I'd rather even approach this from recognizing the sickness and the dysfunctionality of humanity as it applies, period, based upon the course that imperialism has taken us. And so as a human being functioning within the confounds of physics, which means I am in motion, in sync with natural law, in sync with the earth, in sync with the planet, in sync with creating life, as opposed to being a virus, a bloodsucker, or a destroyer of life. The true essence of what humanity is supposed to be in terms of being the caretakers of the world. This is why it is the fight we fight. So to some degree, we can draw distinctions from racial types, but at the same time, we have to recognize ultimately what we are dealing with is a humanity sickness, whether we are the predator or the prey. Because you got to realize that when you talk about an ecosystem, it takes both, right? As long as I'm willing to be prey, there will be predators. As long as I'm willing to be a predatory over prey, and I have an abundance of prey, what is there to stop me from the stance of maintaining that. And let's look at this from the natural law perspective, and then I'm gonna move on. If you look at nature, predators are always fewer in numbers than the prey. Predators always have a larger territory of control than the prey. Prey does not need a vast area of land in between them. They operate as preys operate on large scale herds. Whether you look at the ocean for like plankton, which is trillions, and you look at the great whale, which sucks up the plankton by the billions or by the millions as a day-to-day life. And you look at the whale in terms of its natural pattern of territory, which is vast and huge, right? And you can look at it, a lion, as obviously being over a large, vast area of land and looking down on herds and herds and herds of prey. The same thing happens going back to what Chief Quran talked about with the 85, the 10, and the 5, right? And even within the 5, you can break that down within the 85, the 10, and the 5% of the 5, which gets you to what we're talking about within the revolutionary standpoint. So those mathematical dynamics are always able to deal with what we call fractal awareness. And so within the areas of humanity, we have to be able to recognize the nature of the relationship between prey and predator on all ecosystems. And humanity is no different than what we see in nature on that same level. So when we are able to recognize that pattern on the battlefield, then we can form a proper defense and a proper offense to address it. But we have to be able to look at it, and thank you for stating that, Chief, in terms of the Panther being balanced. And so from that standpoint, we have to be able to see ourselves in nature always. And as we do that, when we operate in balance and in harmony with nature, then a lot of the stuff that we're dealing with in terms of like what we're talking about today between problems and solutions and answers will be naturally a part of how you think, so that you don't have to find yourself operating so tactfully, which goes back into coping, as opposed to being strategic in how you walk the planet and how you operate. So with that being said, let's talk about, like I stated earlier, the difference in between when we get into critical thinking, we must elevate it to critical consciousness. Looking at the chart above that here, you got convergent thinking and divergent thinking. Whereas the convergent thinking is all of the facts are pointing inward, which goes into self-reflectiveness and the ability to be able to see how everything comes together to form a holistic approach. Whereas divergent thinking gives you a whole bunch of ideas. Notice how, and we can use ourselves as an example of how we may say, yo, I got a good idea. And then we are emotionally charged to just express that idea. We may not even want to take the steps to develop the idea, but we are emotionally charged in the moment, and we are divergent in terms of just putting it out there. And we put it out there to the point to where you want to throw it up against the wall and you expect it to stick and to form into something that becomes a convergence. That ain't how life works. And too often we find ourselves being emotional in our approach to developing progress. And so it is important that we talk about the polarity between the convergence and the divergence. So the convergence is bringing together, merging all parts in order to determine a collective whole. Whereas divergence is the act of separating, isolating, and taking a part. You see, so one deals with the individual, one deals with the collective, One deals with the inner awareness, one deals with the external perceived or perception. And this is again exposing y'all to maybe higher or different tools that you are able to now employ and use in terms of your awareness, so that you can be more into the difference between answers and solutions, so that we can be on track to address things as it applies to solutions. So in summing that up, convergence is living through the collective, whereas divergence is survival through the individual. Now, there's a balance and a harmony that comes into play when dealing with both. So it's not that one is over the other. That's what we have to understand when we talk about polarizations. It's not about picking sides. Again, don't remove the concept of choice from the equation. But the deal is knowing when one is beginning, ending, and one is taking over or transitioning or transforming into the next step or the next process. So that's in essence what you are seeing. You can also think of it as a yin and a yang. Put it in that perspective from a harmonious relationship. Because think also, every encounter you have with another human being is a relationship. Unfortunately, oftentimes we tend to think of relationships as just an intimate encounter between a sexual situation. But relationships are how everything interacts and interrelates to each other. So now when we talk about the convergence and the divergence, we are addressing relationships between bodies. And that goes back again into your ability to express and recognize natural law and the harmonious relationship that we must have with natural law, which brings us again to the difference between critical thinking and critical consciousness. Okay, and that's really the point that I needed to get us on track with, because now what we're doing is we're in dealing with the essence of solution-based approaches. Now we don't have too much more, because I see people dropping off, and I don't mean to take up too much of y'all time, but this is a very important discussion. So now on the next chart here, we deal with problem-oriented thinking, which goes into critical thinking. And then we have what we call design thinking or solution-oriented thinking, which is creative strategy. Again, this even goes into further breaking down the difference that we still talked about earlier between critical thinking and critical consciousness. Because oftentimes, especially in skill level number 1, we introduce the people to the concept of critical thinking, because critical thinking has been removed from our repertoire in terms of how we move forward as a people and just deal with life on life terms. But there is a level of elevation, a level of what we refer to as non-linear approach that we must be able to take as it applies to critical thinking. So again, I'm not going to break this down too much further, but I want to make sure you are aware of the fact that there are specific routes that are taken in terms of how we address problem solving, and how we must also move upward in our day-to-day addressing of being able to separate solutions, answers, and problems. And in saying that, this chart here kind of just dives into the difference between the critical thinking and the creative strategy, and how both of those can bring you to something toward the end, where one is dealing with problem, the other one is dealing with solution to a problem. And in saying that, the educational goal of critical consciousness in the creation of a democratic society is the intergenerational equality between student and teacher, in which both learning, both question, both reflect, and both participate in the meaning making. It is important to note that the meaning/definition process is shared, for this holds all involved accountable. And that's kind of really like summarizing the whole point of what we in essence started with. Because what happens is the teacher and the student become one, they merge one. And it's not, don't think of the teacher student relationship as being in a classroom. Think of the student teaching relationship again, as what I stated earlier, as being a relationship between two people, a relationship engaging in conscious decision making, engaging in defining, going back to what we stated earlier, dealing with the way I was worded, the definition of foundation. And so that's what's important, is that we are aware of that, and that we are molding that in terms of our leadership building, whether it be internal within the Panther Party or it be external within getting the people to be able to not simply just take on aid and constantly be fed by us as an organization through programs, but to take things to a level to where they are prepared and ready to deal with self-determination and to deal with community empowerment, and be able to now take on the ability to feed for themselves and fend for themselves, and to operate above being domesticated. And so that is the difference here, as to deal with responsibility as opposed to accountability. And so that's what we're working toward. Now I'm gonna shoot through these real quick, and then we can kind of like end from there. So what we're talking about here are just some basic common traits of good problem solvers. Problem solvers know what a problem is. And it's important I say that, because again, the difference between dealing with what we refer to, and we didn't talk much on this, but we stated it earlier, problems and symptoms. Okay, you have to be able to identify the difference between a problem or a symptom of a problem, first and foremost. Because if you are addressing symptoms, then you're not tackling a problem. So therefore you can definitely not be developing a solution, because you are chasing a symptom thinking that you're chasing a problem. So you have to know what a problem is. And that sounds, again, when you just simply state that as a problem solver knows what a problem is, that almost sounds very elementary and basic, and it almost sounds like it insults a person's intelligence. But once you break it down and you talk about, well, are you dealing with an actual problem, or are you dealing with a symptom of a problem, then it makes more sense to you. Number two, problem solvers know when to apply simple or complex solutions. Problems can come with all levels of complications. A good problem solver knows when to apply systematic and complex solutions to the issue, or when to make use of shortcuts to find an easier route to the solution, which again, I stated earlier, there are no shortcuts. But the point being is that when you're dealing with, and we go into this here, dealing with the generational building and the current limitations of collective due to the lack of resource building, which is not the same as currency. That kind of goes into one of the examples, or should I say one of the links that Chief put up when he went into the silent weapons for quiet wars. This is not something we obviously going to even really touch on at all today. But the point is when we mistake a resource for an economy, and we mistake an economy for a currency, then we are in a lot of trouble. So from that standpoint, you're dealing with complexities of situations, and you have to be able to break those down when we talk about capitalism, and be able to see where you are and at what point you want to address one thing, to address another thing, to address another thing. So we have to deal with the complexities of solutions. Number three, problem solvers view problems as opportunities to grow. And I'm not going to go into that one, but that has to be a point of contention for everybody that chooses to be on the path of grassroots organizers, is that there are going to be things that you are faced with, and you have to view all things as opportunities to grow. Problem solvers think outside the box. That goes into why we're even having this discussion, is because you have to be able to be visionary. You have to be able to be, as Chief Karan said, a forward observer. You have to recognize that this is where you have to be, which goes into the difference between accountability as opposed to just responsibility, and knowing the difference between a choice, option, and decision. And this leads us to 48 Law of Power, law number 31. Control the options. Get others to play with the cards you deal. The best deceptions are the ones that seem to give the person a choice. Your victims feel they are in control, but in actuality, they're actually your puppets. Give them options that come out in your favor, whichever one they choose. Force them to make choices between the lesser of two evils, both which serve your purpose. Put them on the horns of dilemma, and they will gorge they'll gorge whichever way they turn. And basically, I threw that in there to get you to recognize this is the plane, this is the weapon that is being used on us on the battlefield all the time, controlling the options, which is eradicating the concept of choice. And it's important that we see that, because that is what's happening, and that's what definitely continues to happen to us across the board. Number 5 here, problem solvers do not feel that they are always right. Be humble, be aware of the fact that anybody can make a mistake, be able to fall within the group dynamics of growth, period, point blank. Problem solvers have well-developed social skills. This goes into the fact that we have to be able to deal with our people, the 85, like Chief said earlier, from the standpoint of raising the consciousness. That's the goal, is to raise the consciousness. This does not mean that everybody's going to be saved. That is stupid to even go into it thinking that way. But the point here is, when we say all power to the people, our goal is not to just isolate ourselves as this elitist clique and start emulating the power structure and just having an elitist mentality simply because we think we know something better than the next person. But the goal is to, again, empower the people and raise the consciousness so that we can deal with outpacing the pace of oppression. Problem solvers would rather prevent than intervene. And when we talk about that, that goes into, again, the idea of dealing with preventive maintenance, the idea of understanding and overstanding something, as opposed to, again, just simply feeding them and not teaching them how to fish themselves. Go ahead, Chief.
Yes, I just want to go off the last point you made about, choosing the lesser between two evils. Mm-hmm. As important as it is to not be overly righteous in our education and what we research, but it's also equally as important to create the appetite to want to seek out these, to want to do that, I would say I work in the loss prevention department of the revolution. We there's holding the line, but there's also making it happen, right? Like we can't sit here and just assume or just put to the wayside that people will eventually pick this up through struggle. It's like, no, like that's one thing we have to our advantage. People know that things are jacked up, but we need to equip them with the proper tools and entice them to learn the proper things and put that hunger in there, to pick up what we're putting down, because it's not necessarily a question of searching for the answers. We got the answers, but it's building that appetite, for people to want to seek out the right answers.
That is correct. And that is very critical to what we're talking about, because let me just use the example again in talking about nature, going into that. When we talk about an appetite from the biological sense, we're talking about the chemical the chemical fires that are hit between the neurons that causes you to develop a taste for something. Whether we talk about this mentally, physically, spiritually, psychologically, the point being is everything that is geared or brought into the sensory input develops a taste or develops a like or a dislike. So when you talk about manipulating and weaponizing certain things against a population, then part of that, and we can use the current example when we talk about what Kanye spoke on about the destructive state of where hip or rap, I would say rap over hip hop, but rap music has been interjected, which led him to the whole thing to talk about the quote unquote untouchables. And this has to do with the fact that the appetite for the type of music that is being consumed by the masses is self-destructive. And it is intentional by design that it is self-destructive types of music that is being bombarded over the airwaves. That appetite for that music goes into the repetitive process of feeding you this particular diet over and over and over. It's like what they say when they talk about an acquired taste. Acquired taste applies across the board, mentally, physically, and spiritually, right? And it goes into the sensory input. So from that standpoint, when you first taste this filth, you identify with it as filth. You see what it is. It's just it's bad for you. But through that constantly bombardment of that texture, you naturally, because this is all you are being exposed to for the most part, you naturally develop a taste for it. And before you know it, it tasted nasty in the beginning, but because you were willing to intake it on a consistent basis, your metabolism, your neurons begin to take that in as a part of who you are. Before you know it, now you humming along to this filth. Now you are dancing and bopping to it. And next thing you know all of the lyrics. Next thing you know, you listening for the next filthy thing to come into your system. And so from that standpoint, you have developed now an acquired taste for the lack of good and pure and adequate nutrition. And you look forward to that grease. You look forward to that high cholesterol. You look forward to that lack of real substance in your musical diet. And so you have developed a taste for something that is self-destructive. That is what they do every single time when you want to control a population. So keep that in mind. So that's that appetite that Chief Quran is talking about. We have to undo that. And again, when you talk about the process of having to unlearn, as opposed to exposing a population who does not have to unlearn, but can learn the right way the first time around, that becomes to be our secret weapon. Let me keep moving here. So number 8 here, problem solvers explore all options. We talked about the difference between choices and options, but when we talk about this from the perspective of dealing with problem solvers, we want to look at every single thing that's brought before us and be able to evaluate everything that's on the table and look at things from that perspective. So I say you must not rely upon a single solution to a problem. As troubleshooters, they are always ready with a backup plan or a new angle toward handling an issue. Most end user problems are built up of multiple problems affecting individual, family, and community. Therefore, our approach must be holistic. And that's all we're getting at when we talk about that. Number 9, problem solvers have reasonable expectations in specific situations. We have to understand that several issues can often have a hand in one problem, requiring patience when it comes to isolating the issue at play. For this reason, be aware that each problem should be approached with realistic expectations. And that's very important because too often we may be gun-ho about jumping out and dealing with this and just getting right away involved in something without recognizing that it is, if I emotionally charge myself into something, I may not be able to really see everything that's involved and address it from the past, present, and future. So that's what's important, very important on that aspect. Number 10 here, problem solvers do not create more problems for others. The goal of a true problem solver is to discover solutions that will not harm or overly inconvenience others. We must avoid the actions which may adversely affect other comrades. The solution will be temporary and the action will be taken to reduce negative consequences for the rest of the group. So and that kind of again just goes right back into the whole thing about charging into a situation. So we have to be careful about that. Basic steps to problem solving. Identifying a problem. We spoke on that earlier when we talked about knowing the difference and knowing how to see a problem. This means using scientific method to evaluate what is the specific problem and what is the supportive symptoms and the harmonic repercussions. And that is being able to take this into a dissecting mode and reverse engineering what it is we're looking at, so that we can piece it back together as a collective. Number 2, determine the criteria for your solution. Before generating a solution, you must first define what you expect to achieve. And that goes into the forward observing that the Chief talked about earlier. Number 3, create possible solutions. Try to generate several possible ways to rectify a problem. Do not rely upon a single solution. If the problem is complex, you may need to consult experts or perform further research on the subject. Again, that plays into the fact that when we talk about that information overload earlier, we're dealing with the people who take for granted the aspect of what true and in-depth research really is. And if we want to really develop a solution to something, we must be willing to go there, which is why we started off talking about, to get to the root of a problem, you have to get dirty or you have to dig in the dirt. That's just in essence what we're saying there. 4, analyze each possible solution and analyze each potential solution alongside the criteria that you created. 5, choose the best solution. Choose the solution that is most practical or most feasible, always employing your local objectives and your 10-point platform. We always have to stay there when we talk about the fact that we want to make sure that what we are dealing with, again, goes into point number 1, where we say we are engaging into the pursuit of freedom. And we want to deal with the self-determination. So the bottom line there is our solution has to go into aspects of the 10-point platform as it applies to this is where we're going. This is our objective as an organization, right? So our local objectives and our 10-point platform needs to be involved in a feasible approach to dealing with the solution. Number 6, create an implementation plan. Have a working strategy to implement your solution. This plan should always help track the plan's ongoing success. This also is why we talked about the difference between convergence and divergence in terms of pushing out ideas as opposed to pulling in facts so that you can create and deal with an implementation plan. Number 7, and with that being said, document all information connected to your solution. Make a list of all information you require from steps 1 through 6. Attempt to keep your findings to be concise, concise to ease of reference. Present your solution plan to a collective group when detailed written analysis and with detailed written analysis and reporting. Explain why these are the best choices towards solution. Be prepared to go before a murder board. And for those that don't know what a murder board is, basically a murder board is when you are presenting your solution or you presenting your situation here in up against the test of finding people going in and finding the reason why it will not work. finding a reason why your solution is not a real solution. And this is why we talked about how it is important to be able to deal with it from the standpoint of mathematical equations. Because if I am approaching something through the language of mathematics, then there's no way that you can break apart my mathematic solution, and that is not going to be able to withstand the test of time, because I am in balance with nature, right? So my solution then can go before a murder board, because that murder board is not going to find a way to chop it up, because I am implementing the proper steps of addressing this. You see, as opposed to, I can't be so emotionally attached to my solution to that when somebody find a hole in it, I get all bent up and out of shape and get into my emotions and get pissed off and act like I don't want to have nothing to do with the group no more, because you done found reasons or found things that are wrong, that's wrong with my plan. We have to be able to move beyond our personal attachments to dealing with addressing right and wrong. And so from that standpoint, that is, it is for what's best for the group. It is what we can do that brings about longevity, and adding to, again, the foundational generational advancement of where we're headed within the Panther Party. So with that being said, that is the last of that. And the last page here are just a few points and references that that I thought was important to give us. Any questions before we close out here?